Hi, welcome to the fourth episode of U.S. History, But Interesting, the series where we go through American history connecting with the past by Alan Brinkley chapter by chapter and talk about what the textbook says, what it doesn't say, and why you should care about this history right now in the 21st century. Today, we're covering Chapter 4, The Empire in Transition, which covers the French and Indian War and the lead up to the American Revolution. Let's get into it. When you study history, you'll often notice that several wars get grouped together into a series of conflicts that lead directly from one into the next. The two world wars and the Cold War are the most obvious example of this, but for a contemporary example, the ongoing War on Terror can be described in this way as well, as the American invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq in the early 2000s led directly into America's war with ISIS in the 2010s. There's a lesson in there somewhere about the way that wars tend to cause more war before they ever actually cause peace, but for now, let's skip that and talk about the series of four wars that Britain, France, and sometimes Spain fought for domination of North America during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Now, in the context of American history, we refer to the first three wars with the name of the British monarch who was ruling at the time. For example, King William's War happened from 1688 to 1697. You don't really need to know any of the details of that war, just the fact that it happened. Second was Queen Anne's War from 1702 to 1713. Here, I just want to note that as part of the peace settlement, Britain forced Spain to grant them what's called an asiento, which is a monopoly on the slave trade with Spanish America. This agreement allowed British merchants to supply about 5,000 enslaved people per year to the Spanish, and it led Britain to become the largest player in the international slave trade for the rest of the 18th century. Then, from 1744 to 1748, they fought King George's War, which is notable because American colonists actually succeeded in taking a large French fort at Louisbourg, but they were forced to give it back at the end of the war in exchange for a city in India, which the American colonists didn't especially care about. This is one of our first inklings of a trend that we'll see throughout this chapter of the growing disconnect between the British government's priorities and how they run the empire, and the American colonists' priorities and how they think the empire should be run. That brings us to the fourth war in this series, the French and Indian War, which we're going to actually talk about in detail. Now, the story your textbook tells about how this war started goes essentially like this. The Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy, was the dominant Native American power in the Great Lakes region. Their job was to play the British and French off of each other to maintain a delicate balance of peace in the region. However, following King George's War, and I'm going to read this in the way that I assume Dr. Brinkley would say it, quote, "The Iroquois, in what in retrospect appears a major blunder, began to grant trading concessions in the interior to English merchants. In the context of the already tense Anglo-French relationship in America, the decision to side with the British set in motion a chain of events disastrous for the Iroquois Confederacy." End quote. The French saw these concessions to the British as a threat, so they moved in and started building forts. The British eventually responded, and that started the war in 1754. Now at this point, active viewers will be asking, but haven't the English and French been fighting periodic wars against each other for like 600 or 700 years at this point? Didn't the British King George II still technically consider himself the rightful king of France during this period? And didn't they just finish fighting 3 other wars for control of North America? Isn't it sort of silly to blame the Haudenosaunee of all people for this war given that context? And those are all good points, but you see, if we look at the 18th century international chore wheel, it clearly states that the Haudenosaunee were in charge of preventing war between Britain and France, so really they only have themselves to blame. In case you can't tell, yes, I actually do think this is a pretty silly way to cover the start of the war, so we're going to do the what your textbook doesn't tell you section right now to talk in a little bit more detail about how and why the French and Indian War really started. The French and Indian War basically started as a conflict over who was going to own the land in the Ohio River Valley. But it's a little bit more complicated than just Britain and France both wanted to rule the world and they picked a place sort of at random to fight over. To explain specifically what was important about this region, I actually want to start with the indigenous people who were already vying for control over the land long before this war ever started. If we go back to the 1600s, the Ohio country was occupied by literally dozens of different Native American nations, like the Shawnee, the Miami, and the Wendat or Huron Confederacy, to name just a few. When Europeans came to North America, they found that the northeastern part of the continent contained a lot of beavers, whose fur was valuable back in Europe because they could use it to make hats and coats. To satisfy this demand, the French started trading with the Wendat, and at the same time the Dutch started trading with the Haudenosaunee. The Haudenosaunee made so much money selling furs to the Dutch that they basically hunted beavers to extinction in their own homeland. To solve this problem, they took the guns that the Dutch supplied them with and invaded all of their neighbors to conquer new hunting grounds. The first part of these so-called Beaver Wars went extremely well for the Haudenosaunee, and they wound up controlling an area that encompassed 6 or 7 modern U.S. states. However, this was actually disastrous for most of the other indigenous people in the Great Lakes region. The Wendat Confederacy, for example, was essentially destroyed, and many other tribes were forced west as refugees. Now, as the French presence in North America became more powerful, they got more involved in fighting the Haudenosaunee themselves, and eventually forced a peace treaty in 1701. The Great Peace of Montreal, as it would be called, was actually a massive accomplishment of French diplomacy, as it involved securing agreements from 39 different indigenous nations. This treaty essentially said that the French and the Haudenosaunee would end the war and allow refugees from the Ohio River Valley to return to their homeland. So that kind of sets up the general state of indigenous diplomacy in the early 1700s. The Haudenosaunee, who had aligned with the British after they took control of New York from the Dutch, were the most powerful Native American group, and they still ruled most of the Ohio country on paper, but basically all the other Native Americans in the region had sided with the French during the Beaver Wars and would continue to do so because of their obvious grievances with the Haudenosaunee and their British allies by proxy. Now, given that the French had just secured the fur trade with the Great Peace of Montreal, why did they feel like they still needed to set up a military presence in the Ohio River Valley in the 1750s? Well, for one thing, they still needed to secure the fur trade from the British. But for another, if you look at a map of France's empire on the continent, you'll notice that their main holdings at this point were essentially Canada and Louisiana. The fastest way to get between those two places was by sailing across the Great Lakes and then down the Mississippi River. The only catch was that that path required you to travel overland to get from the Great Lakes to the Ohio River and eventually the Mississippi. For that reason, it was essential for the French to maintain control of that particular stretch of land in the Ohio River Valley. That's why they started setting up forts like Fort Duquesne around modern-day Pittsburgh in the 1750s. In their eyes, they were protecting not just the fur trade, but also their lines of supply and communication for their entire colonial empire. On the side of the British colonists, their interest was what it basically always was. Their population was growing and they wanted more land. However, it's worth noting that there were sort of two separate reasons why people wanted more land during this time. The first is the obvious one. New immigrants and young people wanted their own farms and they needed land to set up those farms. But the second was that rich people saw land speculation as a way to make a bunch of extra money without having to work especially hard. The appropriately named Ohio Company was established for that purpose, and some of its main investors included the Royal Governor of Virginia and two of George Washington's older half-brothers. When the governor heard that the French were building forts in the region, he got worried that he might lose his investment, so he sent a 22-year-old George Washington and a mix of militia and regular troops to defend British settlements in the Ohio country from the French. Washington, whose family, remember, had a financial interest in removing the French, and who personally had an interest in becoming a war hero, chose a rather liberal interpretation of his orders. He ambushed a group of Frenchmen, killed 10 of them, and captured another 20, and in doing so, he started what would eventually become a global war. So that's the real story of how the French and Indian War started. The conflicting interests of Britain, France, and various indigenous nations set up a powder keg in the Ohio River Valley, and the match that set it all off was just the personal financial interests and ambitions of a handful of Virginia aristocrats. That brings us back to what your textbook does say. The French counterattacked and Washington retreated to the hastily constructed Fort Necessity, where he was quickly forced to surrender and sent back to Virginia. The following year, 1755, the British sent an army under the command of Edward Braddock to kick the French out of the Ohio River Valley. Now this seemed like a good thing for the colonists, because a professional European army was going to come deal with the threat to their frontier. But there was a catch. You see, Britain sent the troops to fight the war, but they expected the Americans to provide food for them, as well as horses and wagons to carry their supplies across the mountains into the Ohio country. Benjamin Franklin, who happened to be there because he's kind of just the Forrest Gump of 18th century America, offered to put something in the local newspaper to encourage people to volunteer their wagons for service. But his ad ends with the following ominous statement. If this method of obtaining the wagons and horses is not likely to succeed, I am obliged to send word to the general in 14 days, and I suppose Sir John St. Clair, the hussar, with a body of soldiers, will immediately enter the province for this purpose, which I shall be sorry to hear, because I am very sincerely and truly your friend and well-wisher, Benjamin Franklin. The message was clear. If we don't give the British Army what they want, they are prepared to take it at gunpoint. Now, Braddock was expected to succeed because he was British and not a filthy colonial like Washington, but in reality, he failed pretty catastrophically. About two-thirds of his troops were either killed or wounded, and about 70% of his officers died. Interestingly, George Washington was one of the few who made it out without injury, a fact which earned him a certain celebrity status in colonial society. These experiences with Braddock's expedition contributed to two growing sentiments in the colonies. First, that the British felt like they could push the colonists around however they wanted without consequence, and second, that the regular British military wasn't actually that much better than the colonial military. The following year, 1756, war was officially declared in Europe, and the British began to take more direct control over the conflict, which now encompassed European colonies in India and Southeast Asia as well. Back in North America, the British conquered French Canada and forcibly deported thousands of French Acadians out of Nova Scotia. Some of the Acadian refugees who survived this wound up in New Orleans and eventually became the people we now call Cajuns. Meanwhile, back on the American front, French-aligned Native Americans started wreaking havoc on settlements on the western frontier. Now, the textbook makes it sound like the only indigenous people who sided with the British were the Haudenosaunee, but that's not actually true. Virginia and South Carolina allied themselves with the Cherokee, who became vital to their ability to defend the frontier. More on this later. In 1758, the British sent a third and final expedition to take out Fort Duquesne. The army actually wasn't super successful this time either, but in the background, the British and the Haudenosaunee had gathered representatives from the French-aligned Native American nations and negotiated what's called the Treaty of Easton. This agreement essentially said that the Native Americans would stop supporting the French in this war, and in exchange, the British would honor native claims to the land in the Ohio River Valley. More on this later as well. The combination of this treaty and the fall of Canada made it impossible for the French to supply Fort Duquesne, so they literally just blew it up and left, essentially giving the British a win on this front as well. After the fall of Fort Duquesne, the Cherokee I mentioned earlier were passing through Virginia on their way home. Now at the time, there was a bounty being offered for the scalps of dead Shawnee warriors, but the colonists figured that the Cherokee were basically close enough. So the Virginians attacked their former allies, killed a number of them, and scalped their bodies for money. Yikes. This led to the Anglo-Cherokee War, which ended several years later with the British expedition burning a number of Cherokee villages and forcing a treaty that surrendered more land to the white colonists. If you're interested, I'll link to a podcast with the author of a book on this war in the description. The larger 70 Years' War ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, in which the French gave the British Canada, some of their colonies in the Caribbean, all of their colonies in India, and everything on the continent east of the Mississippi River. The only exception to that was New Orleans, which went to Spain along with all of French Louisiana west of the river. So, what were the consequences of all that? Well, the most obvious result was that France was completely removed from continental North America. They still held some colonies in the Caribbean, including a particularly profitable one in modern-day Haiti that we'll come back to later, but at a high level, France's ability to really challenge Britain for dominance over the continent was gone. Secondly, Britain gained a bunch of land, like a preposterous amount of land. And among that land was the land in the Ohio River Valley that the American colonists had started the war for. Americans saw the end of the war as a green light to start settling west of the Appalachians. However, the Native Americans who lived there were not ready to give up their land just because someone on the other side of the ocean had painted the map red instead of blue. An Ottawa man named Pontiac led a group of different tribes against the colonists with the goal of driving them out of the Ohio country entirely. The fighting was brutal on both sides, but this war actually features one of the most notorious atrocities committed by Europeans against Native Americans, and it's worth mentioning this here. During the siege of Fort Pitt, the British attempted to purposefully infect their enemies with smallpox by giving them blankets from sick people in the fort's infirmary. There is some debate about how effective this strategy was, but there is no doubt that the British tried it. In a letter discussing this action, Geoffrey Amherst, the commander of all British forces in North America, told his subordinate, quote, "You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race. That is, use biological warfare and any other means necessary to commit genocide against these people." It really doesn't get much more explicit than that. Now, Pontiac's War encouraged King George III to issue the Proclamation of 1763, which said that the lands west of the Appalachians would be reserved for Native Americans and off limits to white settlers. From London's perspective, this made perfect sense. I mean, after all, this was what they'd agreed to at Easton 5 years earlier. And besides, now that the French were out of the way, there wasn't any particular reason for them to keep fighting in the American interior. That land all belonged to King George one way or the other, and if they could stop the war, and more importantly, stop spending money on the war by just telling the colonists to stay on one side of the mountains and telling the Native Americans to stay on the other side, then that was perfectly fine. But from the American perspective, this was a slap in the face. I mean, as one example, George Washington had used his wealth and political position to buy up 30,000 acres of land in the Ohio River Valley, which, for context, is about twice the size of Manhattan. And he'd done that because he believed that land would become more valuable once it was secured for white settlement. If the entire Ohio River Valley was reserved for Native Americans just because they already lived there or whatever, what was the point of even starting the war in the first place? As you may have guessed if you're good at spotting patterns, Americans often just ignored the Proclamation of 1763 anyway and went ahead and settled in the Ohio country. As long as it didn't lead to any more large-scale wars, Britain didn't really have the resources or desire to stop them. Now, up to this point, the British government had largely followed a policy of salutary neglect, which is a fancy way of saying that as long as the colonists basically did what the Crown wanted, the British wouldn't worry too much about enforcing all of the specifics of their trade regulations, like the Navigation Acts. This long period of relative autonomy led Americans to develop a tradition of self-governance, placing far more trust in their own local governments than they did in the larger British government. It's worth noting, though, that the trust the Americans put in their local governments only extended to their own individual colonies. There was no real unity across colonies at this point, and actually, in the early days of the French and Indian War, Ben Franklin proposed what's called the Albany Plan of Union to fill that gap, but nothing ever came of it because none of the colonies were willing to give up any power to this union. The idea of America as a unified entity was still decades in the future at this point. Anyway, following the French and Indian War, Parliament and the new King George III decided to become more actively involved in the American colonies. This may have seemed like a good idea on paper, but in practice it drastically increased American animosity towards the British government. One of the largest sources of this new tension was taxation. You see, wars are expensive, and global wars like the Seven Years' War are extra expensive. Because much of the fighting had happened in North America, Parliament decided to raise the money that it needed by taxing the colonies. In 1764, they raised the import tax on sugar from non-British Caribbean colonies, and they actually enforced it this time, even setting up a system where smugglers would be tried in vice admiralty courts instead of local American courts. American colonists didn't like this because, number one, the courts didn't have a jury, it was just the judge that the king got to appoint, and number two, the court was physically located in Nova Scotia, Canada. The following year, Parliament passed the Quartering Act, which said that British troops would remain in America, and the colonists would have to pay to supply and house them. They also passed the Stamp Act, which required colonists to pay a tax to get a special stamp on basically anything paper, from legal documents to newspapers and even playing cards. Now, all of these policies did succeed in raising money, but in terms of the American perspective, I think your textbook says it well. Quote, "There was something in this program to antagonize everyone." Unfortunately for Parliament, the people who were the most impacted by these policies tended to be people with outsized political influence, like wealthy merchants or newspaper printers. The backlash they helped drive came swiftly in the form of the Virginia Resolves, which stated that Virginia could only be taxed by their elected legislature and not by Parliament. In Massachusetts, they called for an intercolonial assembly called the Stamp Act Congress, which met later in the year with representatives from 9 colonies and reaffirmed the ideas that the colonies could only be taxed by their own representatives, although it did also state that the colonies should be subordinate to the government in London. They still weren't advocating for independence yet. At the same time, riots broke out, organized by the Sons of Liberty to oppose the Stamp Act. They burned stamps, they intimidated tax collectors, sometimes by tarring and feathering them, and they even broke into the lieutenant governor's house in Boston and tore the place up. The most effective form of protest, though, were boycotts. Colonists agreed not to buy imported British goods, and the Sons of Liberty intimidated reluctant colonists into participating. This hit British merchants in the pocketbook, and the following year they convinced Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. At the same time, though, Parliament also passed what's called the Declaratory Act, which essentially says, we can tax you whenever we want, we just don't feel like it right now. Also, our girlfriend is super hot, she just goes to a different school. In 1767, Charles Townshend passed a new set of taxes on paper, lead, glass, paint, and tea. At the same time, Townshend dissolved the New York Assembly, hoping to pressure them into obeying the law about quartering British troops. Townshend believed that by singling out just New York, he could isolate them from the other colonies and force them to bow to pressure. But instead, Massachusetts began advocating for opposition to all new taxes from Parliament, and the other colonies eventually rallied behind them. Townshend's last major act was to establish a commission in Boston to prevent smuggling. This angered wealthy Boston merchants who had gotten used to smuggling during the years of salutary neglect. They organized another boycott, and the British were once again forced to back down in 1770, repealing all of the Townshend duties except the tax on tea. This reduction in taxes was not enough to appease the colonists. They wanted all of the taxes gone, and they were not shy about expressing it. Harassment of customs officials in Boston got so bad that the British had to station 4 regiments of troops there to protect them. The situation was already tense in Boston because of unfavorable economic conditions, and the soldiers only served to inflame the situation. In March of 1770, a group of Americans began hurling snowballs and rocks at the sentries at the customs house. A few British troops assembled in front of the customs house to protect it. It's not entirely clear what happened next, but there was a scuffle and the Redcoats fired into the crowd, killing 5 people, including a mixed-race sailor named Crispus Attucks. This event came to be known as the Boston Massacre, and it would serve as a symbol of British tyranny in the years to come. The next major event came in 1773, when Parliament passed a law that allowed the East India Company to sell tea in the colonies without paying the import tax. This angered colonial merchants because they still had to pay the tax, and it meant that the East India Company could undercut their prices. For everyday Americans, this actually lowered the price of tea, but at this point it was a moral issue, and so they still boycotted it anyway. In December of that year, a crowd of Bostonian Sons of Liberty dressed in Mohawk garb boarded the East India Company's ships in the port and dumped all of the tea into the harbor, in what would become known as the Boston Tea Party. Now, before we get to the British response to that, I want to go on a quick tangent and answer 2 questions. Number 1, what did the colonists actually believe? I mean, was this really just all about not wanting to pay taxes, or was there something deeper here? And number 2, given how politically fragmented America was and how far-flung the colonies were geographically, how did they manage to coordinate their actions or even formulate shared beliefs in the first place? Philosophically, American dissidents believed in a lot of the British Enlightenment ideas that we talked about last time: individual rights, life, liberty, property, that sort of thing. There was also a growing sense that the king and his ministers had become too powerful, essentially allowing the king to become a tyrant and trample over the colonists' rights with impunity. The most obvious such right was the right to only be taxed with their own consent, that is, no taxation without representation. This dispute was actually a little bit more complicated than it seems on its face. The British argued for something called virtual representation, which is the idea that whether you directly vote for them or not, members of parliament represent the interests of the entire empire, including people in the colonies. Americans favored what's called actual representation, or direct representation, which is the idea that a community should be able to directly vote for its own representative, who would then serve the interest of that community in particular. By that definition, the colonists did not have representation in Parliament, which meant that Parliament shouldn't be able to tax them. They argued for a separation of powers where Parliament could make laws for England and the Empire at large, but only the colonial assemblies could make laws for the colonies. Now, this dispute was an actual important philosophical difference in terms of how democratic governments should be structured, but it's worth noting that neither system allowed all people, or even a majority of people, to actually vote at this time. Enslaved people, women, young people, foreigners, and in many cases anyone who didn't own land were all barred from voting. So in reality, even under the American system, this would only really be direct representation for middle and upper class adult white men, and in general, the colonists weren't really trying to change that aspect of the system at this time. So that brings us to the second question. How did these ideas spread, and how did people organize protests based around these ideas? Well, you have to understand that the colonists were not uniform in their beliefs by any stretch of the imagination, but they still had a number of tools at their disposal. First, you had committees of correspondence, like the one Sam Adams started in 1772. These were essentially groups of well-connected colonists who wrote back and forth to each other to spread news, denounce new British outrages, and coordinate actions like boycotts or tarring and feathering tax collectors. Second, you had taverns, which were a place where common people could meet, have a drink or 12, and discuss revolutionary ideas and actions. These institutions were especially useful because people who couldn't personally read could often find someone in a tavern to read the latest newspapers and pamphlets to them and learn about revolutionary ideas that way. That brings us to published writing, usually in the form of newspapers and pamphlets. Essentially, anyone with enough money to buy a printing press could start their own revolutionary newspaper and spread their ideas about how terrible the British were and what people should do about it. Pamphlets had an even lower barrier to entry because they were usually relatively short, one-time discussions of a topic, which you could pay someone else to print for you. We'll talk about the most famous revolutionary pamphlet, Common Sense, by Thomas Paine, in the next chapter. If you need a way to remember that, committees of correspondence were basically Twitter, where everyone complained constantly about all the people and things they hated. Taverns were basically Facebook, where a bunch of drunk, borderline illiterate people yelled at each other about something someone remembered reading somewhere once. And newspapers and pamphlets were like YouTube, where any idiot could set up a platform and spew unsubstantiated rumors and conspiracy theories into the void with a greater sense of legitimacy because the format made it look vaguely professional. Following the Boston Tea Party, Parliament responded with a series of laws called the Coercive Acts. The main points were, number 1, the port of Boston was closed until the colonists paid for the lost tea. Number 2, the Massachusetts Charter was removed and the colonial government was restructured to allow the British more direct control. Number 3, royal officers could now be tried in England for crimes that they committed in America. And number 4, Massachusetts would be forced to quarter more troops. This was meant to punish Boston in particular, but the colonies were united in their opposition to these acts, which they came to call the Intolerable Acts. Colonists organized boycotts, including mobilizing women's groups to produce substitutes for the British goods that people were no longer buying because of the boycott. We should also briefly touch on the Quebec Act, which seems unrelated at first, but which American colonists viewed as yet another attack by Parliament. You see, the Quebec Act reorganized the previously French province of Quebec, extended its boundary south to include the French settlements in the Ohio River Valley, and granted political rights to Roman Catholics in the province. Once again, colonists who intended to make money speculating in land in the Ohio country felt like Parliament was taking away what was theirs. At the same time, the colonists' widespread distrust of anything even vaguely Catholic spurred conspiracy theories about London's secret evil alliance with the Pope and Rome, which for the record didn't actually exist. The American colonies rallied around Massachusetts, and they even began forming committees of correspondence that stretched across multiple colonies. The Sons of Liberty became a widespread vigilante organization enforcing colonial boycotts. Then, in 1774, after the Virginia Assembly was also dissolved, Virginia organized a meeting of delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, not including Georgia. This meeting would be called the First Continental Congress, and it made 5 major decisions. Number 1, they narrowly rejected forming a colonial union under British authority. Number 2, they wrote a statement of grievances. Number 3, they recommended that the colonists make military preparations for a potential attack by the British troops in Boston. Number 4, they agreed to cut off essentially all trade with Britain in hopes of using economic pressure to force concessions before a war broke out. And number 5, they agreed to meet again the following spring, indicating that the Continental Congress would be essentially a standing, unified government for all of the colonies. Parliament's response, the conciliatory propositions, would not reach the colonies until after the first shots of the war were already fired. In 1775, Americans were storing a large supply of gunpowder at Concord, Massachusetts. British General Gage was stationed in Boston, and he tried to move quickly to destroy that gunpowder supply, hopefully without the Americans ever even noticing. However, Paul Revere and William Dawes did notice, and they alerted the colonial Minutemen, who were irregular troops who were supposedly prepared to fight at a minute's notice. Some of these Minutemen gathered at Lexington and stood in the way of the British advance, but Gage's men quickly dispersed them, killing 8. The British then continued on to Concord and destroyed the part of the American gunpowder supply that hadn't already been moved. The whole time the British were marching back to Boston, American farmers took potshots at them from behind trees and fences. These relatively minor military actions at Lexington and Concord are sometimes referred to as the shot heard around the world, because they mark the start not only of the American Revolution, but also a series of other revolutions that we'll talk more about in the coming chapters against powerful European nations like France and Spain. Since we did the What Your Textbook Doesn't Tell You section earlier, that brings us to part 3. What does this have to do with modern life? In this episode, we talked a lot about political protests. We talked about the events leading up to the protest, we talked about the philosophical arguments behind the protest, and we talked about the ways that protesters organized across different colonies. But I didn't spend a lot of time focusing on the violence that the protesters committed. I covered the Boston Tea Party, obviously, but in the end, that was really just property damage. The protests during this period also routinely escalated to targeted physical violence against people, which I would argue is more serious than vandalism because the tea could ultimately be replaced, but the people who were injured or even killed during these protests really couldn't be. For example, I briefly mentioned tarring and feathering in this lecture, but I didn't tell you that tarring and feathering often crossed a line from public humiliation to public torture. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick's description of the incident that this picture portrays describes the hot tar as, quote, effectively parboiling the victim's flesh. And Philbrick mentions that it took the victim 8 weeks after this incident before he could even get out of bed again. And by the way, there's a reason that this picture has a noose in the background. It wasn't unheard of for these angry mobs to publicly execute their victims without a trial. And lest you think that these were isolated incidents, there's another story where a group of Rhode Islanders boarded a British naval vessel called the Gaspee, shot the captain, and then set the ship on fire. It's really not difficult to find examples of extreme violence in the lead up to the revolution, and you can imagine your own least favorite modern day newscaster, if they were there, cherry picking these sorts of incidents to make an argument sort of like this. We need to call these so-called patriots what they really were: violent criminals. They were killers. They were thugs. They weren't standing up for their rights when they shot the captain of the Gaspee, and they clearly weren't concerned with being equal subjects of the king when they threw rocks at active duty service members trying to enforce the law in Boston. All they cared about was dodging taxes. All they cared about was getting out of having to follow the law the same way that everyone else does. If that meant that they had to stir up riots that plunged the city of Boston into such a state of anarchy that the government couldn't even function without 4 regiments of troops standing guard, then by God, that was what they were going to do. But that feels wrong, doesn't it? I mean, some of the things that I described clearly went too far, but ultimately, we know what these protesters were fighting for. We know what they were fighting against. And we get that none of these violent actions were really about one tax or one single act of parliament. They were a response to at least a decade of increasingly hostile actions by a government that clearly was going to do whatever it wanted, and clearly didn't care what the American colonists thought about it. If we're going to ask ourselves whether this violence was justified or not, we have to consider it along with this broader context. You know, there's a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. that I'm sure many of you have already heard before, in which he says, "A riot is the language of the unheard." That's one way to look at what was happening in this chapter. The colonists tried to send statements of protest to London. They sent representatives in person. They did boycotts and non-importation agreements. But by 1775, it was clear to many Americans that the peaceful options had all failed, and that the only way they could have their voices heard in London was by taking up arms. So when you turn on the news this year or next year, and you see protests that involve some degree of violence, I want you to remember 3 things from this lecture. Number 1, political violence is not new in American history, and it's not inherently un-American either. That doesn't mean that all violence or even most violence is justified, but it does mean that you shouldn't let the scary footage that's playing beside the newsreader convince you that the whole country is automatically going to fall into chaos because someone somewhere smashed a window or started a fire. Number 2, you should understand that most human beings don't default to violence as their first option. When you see protests turn violent, it's usually because those people are desperate. They feel like something has to change, and they feel like they've exhausted all other avenues for making people hear their concerns. Number 3, protests usually have one thing that sparks them, but they're usually really about things that have been going on for a very long time. And when you really take the time to understand not just the one thing that led to the protest, but the entire history of the series of things that happened to escalate tension over the course of months or even years or centuries, then protests get a lot easier to understand and contextualize. You're still not going to agree with every single protest you come across, but at least you can critically engage with them and have a discussion about how to solve the underlying problems, rather than just seeing the photos and thinking, well, those guys look like criminals, so they must be in the wrong. Well, that's it for episode 4. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, etc. Otherwise, we'll be back for Chapter 5, The American Revolution, in which America celebrates its first Christmas with that ancient, hallowed tradition of picking a fight with a bunch of German people in New Jersey. See you then.